In an ideal world, every video game enemy should be on equal footing with a player, possessing unique strengths and weaknesses that rewards those better at understanding and playing, while punishing those that aren't. There should be satisfaction in overcoming a tricky enemy type or boss, but it shouldn't require a blood sacrifice of a player's thumbs to get there. Sadly, however, this isn't always the case with developers, which has led to some types of enemies that are either too difficult, broken, or downright infuriating to contend with, worming their way into games over the years. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 most hated enemy types in gaming. Number 10. Poison Spewers. Every gamer will have encountered a poison mechanic in their time gaming, and it's almost always super freaking annoying. Usually reserved for tricky to navigate areas, poison will continually deal damage to a player and can be one of the most infuriating ways of dying. Damage dealt over time is always a pain, with the constant ticking down on the health bar potentially making players flustered under the pressure to get back to safety. So enemies that spit out a constant stream of this damage-inflicting poison are, therefore, always going to be infuriating to deal with. Typically, these poison-spewing baddies can be split into two categories. There's the one that shoot poison as projectiles, and the ones that drop it like pools. The projectile types earn a spot on this list on the back of being able to A. keep inflicting the damage from afar, and B. usually deal more damage than the average melee enemy types on account of the damage over time mechanic. The poison spewers that leave poison pools around the game are different, but have their own set of features that make them an absolute nightmare to contend with. The area of effect factor these poison pools can bring with them end up making the entire environment a hazard, and can be one of the few enemy types that can kill players even from beyond the grave. Number 9. Suicide Chargers. When it comes to taking on video game enemies, the best players will take some time to analyze their surroundings, take note of the different opponents they have in front of them, and methodically plan out which weapons and items and in which order they're going to use to progress. This is especially important if you're trying to operate under some element of stealth. Having a rogue baddie suddenly bursting towards the screen, blowing their cover in a foolhardy attempt to be the hero, is always an annoying thing for them to have to clear. Suicide charges can vary in their health and difficulty in terms of taking down, but it's their sudden charging that can unsettle a player's attention and cause mayhem in a game. Usually the best method of overcoming these kind of baddies is to pick them off before they see you, but that can use up precious time and ammo. And no matter how much prep a player might invest in scanning their surroundings, there's always risk of a charger suddenly appearing on their screen and completely throwing the strategy book out the window. Number 8. Enemies that explode after you kill them. This type of enemy is similar to a suicide charger in terms of how they bravely approach a player, but has the added annoying feature of exploding either before or sometimes even after they've been killed. Think of a classic bob-omb from Super Mario 64 here. Those little guys can come out from nowhere and suddenly start to detonate, causing an AoE effect that can break valuable blocks or knock players incapacitated off of ledges that they've spent painstaking amounts of time scaling. Speaking from far too much personal experience, it is not a good time. There are also those types of enemies that explode and save their AoE damage for after they've been killed. Take the Flame Atronachs from the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, for example. Go through all the hardship of taking one down, only for the entire immediate vicinity to be consumed by flames just seconds after it dies. Not only does this deal a hefty chunk of damage to players, but it also takes out any followers or allies in the area, potentially causing unwanted deaths and even mission failures way outside the player's control. Number 7. Ones that restore health. Now for one of the most gimmicky and forced mechanics in all of gaming, the enemies who cheat with their health are definitely one of the most infuriating things to come across. Usually reserved for big boss battles or the types of baddies that are meant to provide a cinematic and challenging test, anyone who's ever played a Pokemon title and experienced a trainer giving an Alakazam a full restore will know exactly how bad these types can be. Any sort of vampire, priest, or healer is usually the source of a bit of health bar cheating too. Health bars are one of the staples of measuring progress in the gaming world. Deal damage to an enemy until their health bar lowers to kill an enemy. To go through all the hassle of a big fight, draining resources and health, taking them down, only to have a cheat, "Oh, they're fully healed, go do all that again," will never be something players are going to be happy seeing. Watching that health bar quickly fill up 10 times quicker than it took to drain it isn't challenging or rewarding, it's just cheap and annoying. Just accept the player is better than you, game. Come on. Number 6, invincible ones. Following on from the video game villains who cheat with their health bars, there are those types that just completely do away with the rulebook and make themselves completely impossible to kill. In what feels like another cheap ploy by developers to stretch out boss battles and make encounters feel harder than they should be, these types of video game enemies can turn up in almost any genre or title. Now, these will often come up in certain sequences where there's like an invisible layer over the enemy, making them completely invincible for a period of time, and all you can do is hang around and idle until they come out of that state. What takes this type of enemy from the annoying to the infuriating is how, most of the time, they're still fully capable of attacking you, but not receiving any damage in return. One of the worst examples of this mechanic and effect is in Diablo 3 with the shielding affix. This effect will sporadically make elite level groups of enemies from level 22 invulnerable from damage and status effects for 5 seconds at a time. And naturally, these enemies still have the ability to damage and kill you whilst they're invulnerable. Number 5, flying ones that never land. It's a common feature in games to have the odd flying enemies sprinkled in every now and again, even in titles that don't take place in the skies. Whether it be mechanical monstrosities, fantastical beings, or whatever it is Lady Dimitrescu's true form is supposed to be, flying boss battles feel more and more like an inevitability at this point. Being frank for a moment, these kind of encounters are hardly the most intuitive in the world. Players pretty much know at this point that most of the time these enemies that take to the skies only do so to pad the duration of the battle out, and usually require some sort of action to haul them back down to the ground again. However, things get especially annoying when, for some reason, developers make these flying enemies almost impossible to take down unless they're on the ground. Not only can this be an absolute nightmare for players who favor melee builds, but it can quickly turn into some of the most unintuitive and boring sequences possible, with a lot of these enemies being programmed with invincibility perks and irregular flight patterns. Number 4, one-shot kills regardless of anything. One of the cheapest ways video game developers have attempted to raise the stakes and make boss battles feel more grandiose over the years has been through an especially unfair mechanic involving one-shot instant kills. Now, in general, how difficult video games should be is pretty much a subjective opinion that everyone's going to have different takes on. Some might claim that the whole purpose of a title is to spend a decent amount of time dying, so there's that sense of achievement to come through at the end of a playthrough. But when there's a seemingly never-ending flurry of deaths, all coming from doing something as minor as stepping a toe in an enemy's line of sight, it starts to border a bit on the ridiculous. The problem with this design mainly stems from the fact that there's no offshooting benefit to the players in return. There's no particular problem with high difficulty or a boss taking advantage of a certain build in an RPG, but when developers have to lean on insta-killing players, it speaks more about their ability to design a fulfilling video game enemy more than anything else. Number 3, aimbotters. So many games come bundled with different mechanics and sliders that either help or hinder a player, usually depending on how they're performing or how much progress they've made. Enemies start missing on purpose, start moving slower, hit for less damage, all some of the ways in which developers help make things easier on players. But what happens when developers go in the other direction and push things a little too far? As a result, there are some enemy designs that are way better player killing machines than they have any right to be. In a game like Warframe, Liches and Corpus units have noticeably had their accuracy from all ranges and angles dramatically increased. Their detection times reduced and even acquired the ability to hit players when they're behind cover. Not only can this lead to some pretty major issues when it comes to difficulty scaling, but it's a mechanic that is almost impossible to counter. Cover can be bypassed, strafing or zigzagging out of the line of fire can feel redundant when their bullets just seem to follow a player around. And the damage output / rate of fire these enemies operate with means a simple firefight isn't a viable option either. Number 2, small armies. Most video game enemies are tiered in terms of how difficult they are to take down. More often than not, these tiers are based on the size and strength of a baddie, with the smaller enemies typically packing less of a punch and requiring less effort to take down. To actually make these smaller foes a challenge, developers often scatter more of them in a game. The aim is to fluster a player and get them to waste more resources in dealing with them than what is required. However, that does often leave these small clusters of enemies being some of the most infuriating a game can throw up during a playthrough. Take a series like Resistance, known for its cinematic war zones and big baddies. In the original title, Fall of Man, players entered Manchester Cathedral and are set upon by a small army of chimera known as Leapers. The only way to overcome these hordes of enemies is by running around the building, forcing the enemies into a conga line that players can then mow down in a more efficient manner. The proper way of taking these creatures on will either end up with the player wasting all their ammo or being completely swarmed, showing that not only are these types of baddies incredibly annoying to deal with, but they also lead to broken gameplay strategies. Number 1. Ones who don't die. As mentioned previously, we totally get that hitting the reset with a player's death gives the game more replayability and the learning curve needed for more of a sense of achievement. Well, what happens when a player slaves away for hours attempting to clear a boss battle, only to be hit with the sight of them getting back up from beyond the grave, ready to fight again? Well, a metric ton worth of anger is usually the answer. Sequential bosses is the term used to describe video game enemies that require multiple fights against the same creature to fully defeat them. Though the enemy in question is usually presented in a different form, it's rare to find a sequential boss that has entirely different experiences that feel equally worthwhile. Take an enemy like Ganon from Breath of the Wild, who can have anywhere between 2 and 6 stages depending on how you went with the game before that point in taking down his lieutenants. More often than not, the number one aim of a sequential boss is to trick players into thinking they've cleared a major obstacle, only to have the rug pulled out from under them in the cruelest way possible. There are some proper mad masochists out there that go crazy for a video game enemy that just refuses to die, but this author and this presenter, clearly not one of them. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment section if you can think of another hated enemy type in gaming you reckon needs to be on this list. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonnell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.